For the last 2 years, it has been the burning issue for the British electorate. We are talking about Brexit, of course, the momentous decision for Britain to leave the European Union. It is going to affect all of us, but we rarely hear from a panel comprised entirely of people of colour. So today, we're going to change that on JHUK. Hello and welcome to JHUK. On today's programme, we're discussing the UK's decision to leave the European Union, or Brexit, and what it means for Africans both here and at home. I'm Priscilla Winkbo, and on our panel are the recruitment specialist Douglas Pollen, the charity director and cultural critic Kunle Olulode, and the pro-EU campaigner Femi Oluwole. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme.
Hi.
It is just myself and you all today, but I'm ready for you.
That's okay.
So let's go. I mean, this Brexit conversation has been we've been talking about it for the last 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are. Let me come to each of you first. Douglas, you first. Tell me, what does Brexit mean to you?
That's a very difficult question to ask, honestly.
What makes it difficult?
Yeah, because we don't know what Brexit is going to be yet because of what the negotiations are. So I mean, it would be very hard to put a finger on it to say exactly what it is. I mean, but what I know at the moment is Brexit to me is a very difficult situation that I want to be over and done with as soon as possible.
Okay, where do you stand on it? When you say you want it over and done with as soon as possible, where do you stand on it, given where we're at now?
A part of me feels that we're at a point of no return. So, I mean, the UK is going to go ahead with Brexit, even if it means we just want to save face.
Really?
Yeah, I think that's where we are at the moment, because a lot of noise has been made, a lot of money has been spent.
So, are you for it or you want out?
I mean, in an ideal world, I want us to stay in a reformed EU, an EU that is a bit different from maybe what it is now. But I think the way to create that reform and to make us stronger as a country, as a UK, is to create the reform from within and not to leave a powerful, unreformed EU as our trading
Okay, we're coming to that. We're coming to that in a minute. But let me come to you, Kunle. How are you doing today?
I'm fine.
Lovely. Now tell me, where do you stand on this, given where we're at almost 2 years later? I think we're like 147 days or so away from leaving.
I think that the democratic will that was demonstrated on the 23rd of June 2016 needs to be exercised. At the moment, I would say that the negotiations are proved more than just challenging for the government. I don't think they've been wholeheartedly committed to them. But I think that in the next few days will be clearer in terms of whether we are offered something that is consistent with the view of the people, or something that is a compromise, which may in fact even alienate all sides of this discussion.
I'm going to come to you about that compromise, because I need to understand what it means. But I'm going to come to Femi now, because Femi, I know you've been so active, my king of Brexit on Twitter here. So tell me, for you, what does it mean at this stage and where you at?
Brexit for me means a complete betrayal of ordinary working people in this country. I mean, people who are at the bottom, the moment there's an economic hit, it's them that suffer most. Because if we suffer economically, Westminster isn't going to suddenly start caring about people it's never cared about before. So, and it also means that it changes what we are as a country. Right now, we're one of the leading figures in Europe, deciding the path of this entire continent. And we're choosing to step away from the decision-making table. So we'll end up being, I've often said, a UK at the head of Europe is a lot stronger than a UK at the feet of Donald Trump.
I like that line. But I mean, I hear what you're saying, but there's one thing that I noted right at the very beginning of the conversation, and it is still relevant till now, and that is that we don't see enough people like ourselves having this Brexit conversation. It's been, you know, what does it look like, you know, for people of African origin, of Caribbean origin, living in the United Kingdom? What would you say it looks like? I know you've mentioned about the economic impact there.
Well, according to the Ashcroft exit polls from 2016, it was 73% of black people voted to remain in the EU. So this isn't a decision that black people in general are in favour of, but yeah, there's been very little representation of black people in discussions around this issue. And I think that's unfortunate, especially given that minorities will be disproportionately affected. I mean, I've had personal family members of mine who have, a family member of mine was pushed to the floor and saying, "It's time you get out, we won."
Wow. So they've had that experience,
yeah.
You know. Kunle, for you, obviously you're one of those that voted to say we must be out. Yeah. And as a person of African origin, you know, what does it look like for you now?
For me, well,
given the experience that Femi's relative
first of all,
has had.
I've got to take Femi up on this issue that this is a betrayal of working class people. Absolutely the reverse. In the main, Leavers have been incredibly patronized and basically disparaged by Remainers. We've been accused of being stupid, of not understanding the issues. Even the demonstration for the second referendum, it's not an honest demonstration calling for a vote for the
Did you just
ND.
use the word honesty?
Yeah.
Because I think the Leavers are guilty of something about this being dishonest in the campaign.
It depends who you address. You made the right point that we don't hear enough of our own voices in this debate. When I did many debates with both Leavers and Remainers who looked at things like the offer for the NHS of the 150 million, and we all agreed that this was politicking. Nobody with any intelligence would believe that was going to be the end result.
That's very unfair.
Go for it.
That's very unfair. I mean,
I said Leavers and
personally,
Remainers had that view, and we didn't have any dissent in any of the debates that I was involved in.
Maybe in the debates that you were in, but I studied EU law, and even despite that,
what's it got to do with the EU law?
What has Brexit got to do with EU law?
But what has that issue in terms of the 150 million for the NHS got to do with EU law?
Because leaving the system of EU law causes an economic damage which far outweighs any benefit that you could possibly get to the NHS.
Okay, so before the two of you have this fight, I need to know what Douglas is thinking, because obviously, Douglas, you know, you also of African origin. How are you feeling about all of this? How does it reflect? Where do you see us, as it were?
At the time of the referendum, the tone of the discourse at the time was quite toxic. And a lot of people a lot of minorities felt kind of left out because they were at the receiving end of the abuse and the racism and all the hate, because people completely misunderstood what the issues were. I mean, that's why I think maybe a lot of the Leavers were guilty of that. They thought it was a referendum to get rid of minorities. I was listening to a program on the radio the other day, and someone said he was hoping that like Brexit will happen and all the brown people will leave. So, I mean, it shows you how much of a misunderstanding is out there. I mean, I'm not saying all Leavers are that way, but you find that these voices are being heard. I mean, this...
I agree with you in the sense that it was very clear on the streets that people of African origin, minorities, were speaking about immigration. But, you know, let's go back home to Africa. Let's look at the African Union. Will it be acceptable for a member state, for instance, to decide to leave the African Union? I mean, how would that reflect for me?
For a member state of the African Union?
Of the African Union to decide to leave, pretty much as we're seeing with Britain choosing to leave the EU at the minute.
Well, I mean, quite simply, what people often forget is this rule in economics which is called the gravity rule, which means that you do most of your trade with the countries that are close to you, because it makes sense. Exporting to a neighbor country is a lot cheaper than exporting to the other side of the world. It's why even Donald Trump, when he started his little trade war, he left Canada and Mexico out of it, because not even Trump was crazy enough to disrupt trade with his closest partners. So the idea of leaving the economic partnerships of your local environment is always going to be a bad idea economically.
So if it was in the African Union, are you saying that, you know, it wouldn't, economically, it wouldn't be favorable? But Africa doesn't trade with herself quite as much.
Yeah, which is a problem. I mean, the ability to trade with your close partners is always better for you, as I just explained.
Yes.
Douglas, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? If you were the African Union and a member state decides, you know, we want out of this.
I mean, in every situation, I mean, every negotiation is conducted with people. And it all comes down to respect, I think. If people feel like you've disrespected them, they treat you unfavorably. If they feel you've respected them, they treat you well. So leaving a party like the European Union or the African Union, it creates this division. No one likes that. And I think whether people believe it or not, there's an element of trying to get back at you. I mean, try to make you feel that you've made the wrong decision. And that element will always be there. I mean, you'd always suffer some kind of loss, because giving you more, when you leave, would be a signal to everyone to leave. And they wouldn't want that to happen. So they'll go out of their way to make sure.
So you believe the African Union would not equally let go so
Absolutely. They'll try
easily?
to make an example of you so others will stay in line.
We're going to go on a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to hear what Kunle has to say about that. So don't go away. Join us in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. And of course, before we went on the break there, Kunle, you wanted to tackle that question that I had asked. About,
it's a brilliant question. I think that there are differences between the two organizations. Obviously, the AU emerged out of the OAU, which was a political integration, really, as much as anything, rather than the EU, which grew out of an economic model, the European Economic Community. So, the two things are coming from two different ends. But in terms of the specifics, well, of course, Morocco itself left the Union and was outside of it for 33 years because of differences.
She's back now.
Yeah, came back in 2017. But so the question of the possibility of leaving, it's always there. But I think that the idea in both, I suppose, areas that somebody that actually supports the democratic wishes of their own people over and above the union, you're right, is likely to be punished by those that still remain.
Okay, so, staying on the African aspect of things now, during the recent trip to South Africa, Nigeria and Kenya by the British Prime Minister Theresa May, she wants the United Kingdom to become Africa's biggest G7 investor by 2020. This is, of course, is a signal of renewed British political economic interest in Africa. Now, is it going to be a good thing for Africa to have that return?
The question is, how much more improvement can there be in terms of the ease of access for trade? Right now, the EU, of which we're currently a member, has free trade, as in no tariffs, with 33 African countries. So, and that covers everything except arms trade. And so the idea, I mean, the countries that she went to, they have a combined GDP of about the amount of the Netherlands, and that we already have slightly eased free trade, almost free trade via the EU. So there isn't. So what she's trying to actually do is just to reestablish the trade links that Brexit is destroying. She's making up for a loss, and and we'll see whether or not she does that.
Will it not be a renewed relationship, Douglas?
The dynamics are quite different now, because you're dealing with countries that are mostly independent, countries that have entered into trade deals of their own with countries around the world, countries that have also, I mean, most significant, received quite huge investments from China. China is a major player in Africa at the moment. They've invested tens of billions of pounds across the continent. They've got commitments from governments across the continent, from the east to the west, north, south, everywhere. So in terms of going in there and
So are you saying that this is more likely to be a battle between China and the UK?
Absolutely. It's going to be very difficult, because I think what's going to happen is if she offers a deal, China is going to offer a sweeter deal, because they've got actual investments there. They're not intending to invest. They've invested already. They've shown the will to invest even more.
But then China's investment is questionable by some. I'm coming to that. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But Kunle, you know, this is one of those points that the leavers were saying was really important. We'll go back to the World Trade Organization's rules and so on and so forth. But will Africa really benefit?
In terms of benefiting, then it's about the terms of trade. I mean, Femi's made it sound like, you know, in terms of tariffs, African countries can just come into Europe and produce what they like and sell it. It's not happening like that. Africa produces some of the highest grade cocoa in the world, and yet we don't have a chocolate manufacturing plant in Africa. There are rules within the EU that govern their ability to actually do that. So for me, I think it's an exciting opportunity.
I think you might go back to the Berlin conference, actually.
Yes, I think it's an exciting opportunity for Africa to be able to renegotiate the terms of those trade relationships with countries that are outside of the EU. The EU itself, no doubt, will come under pressure because the relative decline in trade, world trade, within the EU, everybody is aware of it. And when you know that there's relative decline, it means you have to do something about it.
I hear what you're saying, the relative decline and all of that, but Femi, I know we've mentioned it a little bit earlier, but are we likely to see a decline in the way our lives go forward henceforth, or is it going to be bountiful, as we are told by our friends on the leave side?
Quite simply, I mean, it was about a week and a half ago that I really slammed the BBC online because their definition of the single market, basically the EU's trade system, was wrong, and it was wrong, and they corrected it 2 days later. The single market, which is the EU's economic system, means that anything made in this country is automatically legal across Europe. That's because we make laws together and we have a system of mutual recognition. That means there's no barriers between us. You can trade with a country a company in Sweden or France as if you were trading with your next door neighbor. And it lowers prices because you don't have to make 28 different versions of the same product. And we do half of our trade with the EU. We get a third of our food from the EU. So barriers to trade are only going to be bad for us. If you look at an example...
I hear what you're saying on the food part, but we were told that our food would be cheaper, you know, with the whole being an EU thing. But our food have not been cheaper though, has it?
Well, I mean, the argument is that if we leave the EU system, then we lower tariffs on food coming from outside and therefore get cheaper food. But quite simply, nobody does what the Brexit people are telling us to do. There is no country that gets most of its food from countries that are on the other side of the world. If you look, even Australia, if you look at the places it gets its food from, they're the countries that are relatively closest to it. It has an agreement with China, an agreement with Vietnam, and America gets most of its food from Canada and Mexico, other than America itself. It is the rule of gravity that you do most of your trade with countries close by. Now, regarding the single market, if you look at how this would affect the working class, take the Northeast, voted heavily for leave. There are 35,000 jobs in the Northeast that depend on a Nissan factory that sends 75% of its cars to mainland Europe. The Japanese ambassador who put that factory there has said that the reason why they choose the UK is because we have that easy access to the rest of Europe. So those working class people, they are the ones who will suffer from Brexit.
Douglas, I'll be right back. Bear with me a second. Kunle, very quickly tell me, because I know that, you know, you guys say that that's not going to be a problem at all.
Well, it's really odd that we go to a supermarket, we see foods from all over the world, and he's telling us that apparently we only buy local. It doesn't work like that.
He's saying we buy the majority local.
Look at Sainsbury. It owns the entire spice output of Grenada, which is sold in high street shops across the UK. So trade is going to continue. Trade deals in terms of their content and who maintains an advantage in those deals is there to be fought. And in terms of, you know, Africa,
so
I think
with regards
Africa can get a better deal.
But it will cost more. That's the point.
Let's hear what Douglas has to say.
It's a lot easier. I mean, you're not an outsider. You're part of the club. I mean, it makes things a lot easier to achieve. I mean, see, for example, something
you're suggesting that this is almost not possible. There has to be something in between.
I think he used the word easier.
It is difficult.
I think he used the word easier.
But then it means it's still going to continue.
Yeah, but
it's still going to continue. But
more difficulty means more expensive. That's simply how business works. If it's easier for me to do something, I charge less. If it's more difficult, my price goes up. Who ultimately will pay this price? That's the question everyone should be asking. It will be the less well-off, the people who are struggling to make ends meet at the moment. I mean, you should go, if you do the research and see how many people are in debt, how people are struggling to live month to month, and then you come back and approach this argument from the points you're saying. I mean, you take a much softer stance than you're taking at the moment, because it's easy to say, all right,
okay,
we can do it.
Let me
Who
ask
creates
you
the
this.
buffer?
Okay, let me ask you this, Douglas, because obviously you're in the recruitment industry.
Of course.
And it's an area that, we've been having conversations about for quite a while now, about the drop in those that are coming from the EU. What are your experiences within that industry?
I would say, I mean, jobs have become a bit more difficult to fill. And there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. A lot of people who are European don't know what will happen next year. I mean, what will happen in the next few months. They don't know. And when you're placed in such a precarious situation, I mean, you can't commit to anything long term. They don't know what the arrangements will be in terms of immigration. They don't know if it's going to be one immigration system everyone is going to use, or if they'll get any kind of preferential treatment. People can't make long-term plans. It's left people in quite a lot of difficulty because they don't know what's going to happen. Imagine if you've moved to the UK from the EU, you've got these plans. I mean, we all have plans for our lives, what we want to do in 5 years, 10 years, wherever it is. We want to build families, we want to buy houses. What would you do, Femi, if Kunle, sorry, what would you do if you were in that situation? Would you buy the house?
Shall I let him answer?
Yes.
Kunle, what would you do?
Yeah, I would, because I think that in terms of the position of EU workers, it will be taken care of. And indeed, all the signs are, right from day one, the question of EU staying, even Nigel Farage on the right was actually viewed the government and said it should have acted quicker on resolving the question of EU migrants and making sure that their position was sustained. I think there are bigger issues in terms of the contrast in treatment between non-EU migrants and EU migrants. When you were talking about equalization of immigration policy, I think that's much more important. Okay. And that's something we as a country need to debate and discuss.
All right, we're going to come to that in a moment. But for now, as you can see, there's so much more to discuss. But we are going to go on a very quick break. Stay with us. We'll see you in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. I'm Priscilla Winkwa and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel. Recruitment specialist Douglas Pollen, the charity director and cultural critic Kunle Olulode, and the pro-EU campaigner Femi Oluwole are all still with me. Gentlemen, I know that for a few moments there our gloves are coming off. But I think it's important that we do look critically at this relationship with China. China is the biggest investor in Africa at the moment. The UK is attempting to rekindle her relationship with Africa. Is it too little, too late, do you think? Let me come to you, Kunle.
I think that the question of competition for Africa, Africans' economies are buoyant.
Yeah.
6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are now in Africa. So it's not just the Chinese that want to be there, the Americans too. We've had Bill Gates, we've had Mr. Facebook. All of them have been coming to Africa now and looking at it in a different light. In Nigeria alone, we have a population of 180 million with 60% under the age of 25. That is a huge potential market and an exciting market. So I can understand China wanting to be there, but I think that the real issue for Africa is how does it actually exploit those tensions between all those different Western states and China who want to compete for business, and how does it turn that relationship around?
I mean, speaking of, how does China, Africa do that? We know that the EU have been trying to get Africa to sign the European Partnership Agreement. the new trade agreement. We also know that Africa also has her own intra-Africa trade agreement, the new agreement that they're trying to get them all to sign. I think so far it's about 50 countries or so that have signed that agreement. But with those agreements in place, does Africa stand a better chance in rekindling this relationship, or in the attempt to rekindle? Is it also an opportunity for better negotiations for Africa?
Well, I mean, in any trade negotiation, your leverage is the size of the market that you have to offer. That's why the EU works. And so if if African countries work together as a trade bloc, they have a lot more leverage, because they can say, if you want access to this massive market we control, then do this, do this, do this. That's how trade negotiations work. And if you have barriers between countries, that only increases costs, and that makes you less efficient, and that hurts the people who need economic improvements most of all.
But, you know, President Buhari said of the EPA, he said he couldn't sign that agreement because it would be damaging to Nigeria's industries as well as the younger generation. So he's holding out on signing that. But, you know, is it too late in this situation for the UK?
I think it depends on how much money the UK has to spend.
Really? Why? How?
Yes. I mean, where Africa is at the moment, the countries need a lot of investment. They need money to be spent. So I think they'll look at the biggest spender with the best terms, basically.
But the terms that Africa has had...
yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful here. We keep talking about Africa as if it's just one monolithic
No, it's
entity.
a huge continent.
We're talking about nation states as well.
1.7 billion people,
again,
or 1.2 billion people.
Drawing on the example of the EU, the nation state is the sovereign guarantee of democratic rights. It's the most important unit for founding democratic rights. So it's not just a simple matter of Africa as a whole negotiating deals. What is the position of the people in those countries in terms of what are they going to get out of these deals?
I mean, will it change? Is there, because, you know, from what Kunle is saying there, it is true of the EU that they've always been very protective of themselves. And with that had come contracts or agreements that were more damaging to Africa than it was beneficial. So are we likely to see that change this time around?
Well, I mean, yes, the tariff policy of the EU in the past was harmful to Africa, but that changed, as I mentioned before, the fact that they've dropped tariffs completely with 33 countries across Africa. And regarding the intra-Africa trade deal, I think that, like I said, that puts Africa in a far stronger position. If you've got the EU trying to negotiate against individual countries, who do you think comes off better in that situation? Because if you've got one small country against the entire EU, who wins? I mean, we're seeing the same thing with the Brexit negotiations. We have one country against 27. Who wins? If Africa works together, if African countries work together as a unit, they're a lot stronger.
But then, you know, we have our European leaders going out and they're going to the different blocks. So they're going to the Southern African Economic Bloc. They're coming to the ECOWAS Economic Bloc. So they're working at the different blocks to be able to achieve this. You know, Douglas, will it change anything? And what kind of relationship will Africa be having now with Europe going forward?
I think it depends on who is sitting on the table on the African side. Because that's a key factor in any negotiation. If you have people who are competent and who know what their people need, you get a better outcome. But what you find most of the time is a lot of the crop of leaders Africa has had for a while now, kind of think about now. They don't look at what will happen to the generation coming after them. So they negotiate deals which make them look good, solve some cosmetic problems, and that's about it. They don't look at the long-term effects of the deals they are negotiating. And these people, the Europeans coming, the Chinese coming, they are very purposeful. They know what they want. That's the level of planning you don't get in the African countries. They just want $2 billion now, build a 14-kilometer road, my people will pass on it, and they'll hail me as a leader who is doing something. It sounds very simplistic.
It can't be that basic, surely. It can't be that basic
but
for
that's
Africa, surely.
I hear what he's saying, and I think there are elements of truth in it, but this is not just an economic relationship. This is also about how ordinary people in Africa are engaged in the decision-making process, so that those things that he's describing do not happen.
Okay, let me give you an example. A few months ago, the Ghanaians were having an argument with the US. the US, the Ghanaians were saying, you're trying to set up a base in our country, a military base, and we don't want it. The US said, no, it wasn't a military base, it was an investment, and there was something along the lines of $20 million to be invested. Ghanaians said no, they were protesting against this, and that conversation continued. So my question to you all now is that, is Africa at the point now where young Africans are much more enlightened? Is social media playing a role? Are we now at that point where, you know, African leaders can no longer make the kind of decisions that you're suggesting, Douglas? Just saying, yeah, you can build a road, but then the rest of the, you know, their citizens will be participating.
There has been some level of reform, but it's not at the point where it's having like a direct effect on how decisions are being made. You've got a crop of people. I mean, it's almost as if...
It did force the US to say no when the Ghanaian media and Ghanaians took to social media rejecting that the military base be built.
But not the Ghanaian government.
It may have not been...
Not the Ghanaian government.
The government said it wasn't a military base.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, why would it have to come down to the ordinary man on the street to make these decisions when there's an elected government of people who have been deemed to be capable or able to...
Because it has to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I understand that, but I mean, it shows the government fell asleep on the wheel. That's what it shows.
But isn't
That's
that a new confidence amongst...
electorate.
Yeah, isn't that a new confidence amongst African citizens? Because, you know, we're all participating in society. It's not just about those that have been elected.
Yeah, I mean, some of the countries in Africa are doing better than others in terms of how democracy works. I mean, if you look at maybe countries like Zimbabwe up till last year, or Uganda, where they've got like the government is ruling with an iron fist, you can't express views and go unpunished. Something happens when you disagree with the paradigm that is in place there. So I mean, there's progress, but I don't think it's progress. Progress is at the point where we should be commending it. I'll tell you why. Because what happens is, if we commend the progress where it is, there's this temptation to rest on our laurels and say, you know what, we've made progress. I mean, things are happening. I think that's true. And then things go back to the way they've been because we've become complacent
so you don't,
and insensitive.
So Kunle, are you saying that with the progress that was being made, that it's likely to be stalled?
I think in a democracy, the government should actually listen. I think at the current time, in terms of looking at Brexit specifically, both leavers and Remainers are squeezed out of that discussion. It's almost like the discussion now is behind closed doors and not an open discussion.
Absolutely.
So in the case of Africa, I think we are seeing examples of this in Zimbabwe, where we have a challenge between leaders and we end up with Bobby Mugabe actually supporting his opposition because he's squeezed out of power. So at the end of the day, the only guarantor is actually the pressure from the people and the accountability they can exert on those governments.
Okay, so Femi, will that change things? Will it change the relationship between Africa and Europe?
I think absolutely. I mean, quite simply, the corruption, the level of wage inequality that I've seen personally when I've been to Nigeria. I mean, like absolute poverty, 10 miles out of the center of Lagos, and in the center it looks like LA. Just complete inequality, and that doesn't happen if people rise up.
All right. Thank you so much, Femi. Well, we're just going to take a quick break, but when we come back, this conversation continues, so don't go away. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. There was always a concern that as the EU grows closer together, migration will become harder for non-EU migrants. Thousands of people, many of them Africans, have died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea and enter Europe. And there's growing animosity towards migrants trying to get into the fortress of Europe. Now, gentlemen, as Africans, do we think that immigration in the UK will be more or less difficult after Brexit?
Well, you often hear this argument that Brexit was racist, and I fundamentally reject the idea that Brexit voters are as a whole racist, but the Brexit campaign, definitely. For example, when you saw Nigel Farage standing in front of that breaking point poster, which showed all the Syrians coming in, the reason why that was racist wasn't because it was showing an accurate photo of a situation. It was because Under the EU's rules, the UK has an exemption. It is not part of the EU's common asylum policy, which means that not one refugee, not one person from outside Europe gets into our country without our say-so. The only people who can are people like Bulgarians or Hungarians, basically white people. But Nigel Farage chose specifically to show brown people as being the problem. So the idea that there will be more people of African or Middle Eastern descent coming to this country, that we'd have a more open immigration system to those people after Brexit, is fundamentally flawed.
Kunle, you're waiting.
Yeah.
Go for it.
The immigration issue is not something that emerged just through Brexit. Anti-immigrant sentiment has existed in this country for the last 30, 40 years, even going back to the Race Relations Act of 1967.
No, that's true, but you agree that Brexit heightened it?
It brought to the surface a debate which had been raging on both the Remain and Leave side. And in fact, as I had indicated earlier, Theresa May was, as Home Secretary, partly responsible for the situation of trying to perpetrate a program of making it uncomfortable for so-called illegal and legal immigrants. The white van scandal, which she led on, was something that I think is completely reprehensible. But this notion that the Remainers were the good guys in this and the Leavers were consistently exploiting the immigration issue, I don't buy that at all. I think that the immigration issue brought to the surface certainly a lot of racists. It emboldened them in the aftermath of the referendum. But that wasn't the essential reason why people voted Leave. It was one of many reasons.
Douglas, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, like the people who have borne the brunt of the whole suffering from the recession are the immigrants.
Okay. So
you had this really bad recession, 2007, 2008, 2009. The economy was going down. There was a lot of uncertainty. A new government comes in. They've inherited this mess. They're trying to clean it up. I mean, what they did, which was, I think, very unfair, was to turn around. And not to say the difficulties were as a result of the recession. The first thing you hear them say is, there are too many people in the country. You're queuing at the hospitals, not because we are closing the hospitals down, but because there are too many people coming in. You're having difficulty making more money, not because there was a recession, but because there are too many people in the country. I mean, they would have gone about discussing it in a more realistic and maybe I'll say more ethical way, to say, look, there are more people in the country. They are not the cause of the problem. We've had a recession. We have to find a way to solve the problems that this recession has caused. However, I mean, these people, I mean, they are not the problem. They didn't cause the recession. I mean, we didn't cause the recession. I certainly didn't. You didn't. But I remember Nigel Farage was going for it. I think he had a TV appearance and he ran late, like, because of traffic. And he turned around and blamed it on immigrants, too many people in the country. That's how ridiculous the conversation got.
I hear you. Femi, I know you want to come in.
Citizens from EU countries make up 5% of our population, yet they make up 10% of our doctors. So rather than immigration being something that threatens the country, it's literally keeping us alive. And yet, so the idea that immigration was a threat and used as a way to get rid of, as a motivation for Brexit was just wrong. And not to mention, it was all these ideas were uncontrolled immigration. Article 7, Citizens' Rights Directive of the EU says, in order to come to this country without a job, you need to have enough money not to become a burden on our welfare state and have your own medical insurance. So they can't come here and live off benefits. They can't come here and clog up our NHS. That doesn't happen. In fact, they are propping up our NHS. In fact, the recent report shows that immigrants provide more to our public services than they take out, and more than British citizens. So this narrative around immigration has been completely broken from day one.
Kunle, I mean, hearing that, because I know earlier you were speaking about the fact that that whole figure of 150 million going back to the NHS, and I know you also make mention of the fact that it depends on who you speak to. But not everybody in the country had the opportunity to hear from every single leaver on their campaign trail. Well, but we did see...
But let's be more specific.
We did see the general messages.
Black leavers. We didn't hear from black Remainers. In fact, we were pretty much excluded from this debate. And what was interesting is that, you know, I myself am a leaver, but I also have very strong connections with the continent. I've worked for on and off for 20 years in Spain. I have very good connections with the EU countries, but have nothing to do with the EU. Those are relationships that have been built up over time. But the equation of being pro-European with being pro-EU and being anti-EU as being anti-European is a wrong kind of construction. But that's the narrative that the media have actually peddled.
How long were you working in Spain and when?
Over 20 years.
When?
On and off from 1993 right through to 2003.
Okay.
I worked for the Mas family in Catalonia, in Barcelona, Spain.
Okay.
So you were literally using your European Union free movement rights for those 20 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not?
Yeah, and those are the rights that Brexit is about to take away.
But you are making an assumption that I'm opposed to freedom of movement. This is the kind of caricature.
That's what Brexit is about to do. That is literally what Brexit is about to do.
Brexit will actually give us the opportunity to have a proper debate about immigration.
So you'll be ready to get visa. So let me ask you. So you'll be ready to get visa to get into Spain.
The whole thing is a big mess. Because you've got 1,000 voices saying different things. I mean, even within the Leave campaign, they can't agree. Within the Remain campaign, they can't agree. I mean, the whole idea of Brexit is so polarizing. It's dividing everyone. I think the approach has been wrong. Even if you wanted change. I mean, David Cameron started something which I think if they had allowed to play out, would have probably resulted in a better EU for everyone.
No chance. They weren't prepared to listen to Cameron.
What he did,
they were not prepared to listen to reform,
was to restrict himself by fixing a referendum date, promising something which he knew overall will not be very good for the country.
On that note, given where we're at today, given all that has been said, where are we? Do we think Brexit will go ahead?
Well, right now, the negotiations have not gone well. In fact, that's the way that, I mean, Our Future, Our Choice, we've been touring the country asking people, our movement of young people for people's vote, we've been asking them what they wanted from Brexit. They wanted more control over their laws, a better NHS, and be better off. Right now, the deal that we're going to get is going to leave us with less control over our laws. The British Medical Association, the Royal College of Nurses, the Royal College of Midwives are all saying Brexit is bad for the NHS. And as for being economically better off, no. Every estimate says we're going to be worse off. So, things people wanted, the will of the people is not being delivered by Brexit itself. In fact, most Brexit voters would say that they're going to get a deal that nobody wanted. The only logical and democratic way forward is for whatever they come back with from Brussels to be put before the people in a people's vote.
Right. Douglas, do you think, given where we're at now, is this going to happen?
I mean, to be honest, I can't say yes or no. I'll tell you why. Because, I mean, who knows? That's the question. That's the question we're going to ask. I mean, who knows? How do you deal with the Irish problem, the northern, like the border, on the Northern Ireland border problem? How? If you can solve that problem, I think you've solved 98% of the problems we are having right now with leaving the EU. So no one has come up with
a solution,
a credible solution to actually solving that problem. And let's not forget how testy things can get around there if there's no good. There's no good deal in place. So it's a major issue that can derail the whole process.
Very quickly, I mean, given where we're at.
I think what we're headed for is a fudge. I think that the possibility of a good Brexit has been eroded by a negotiating team that never really had their heart in it, to be honest.
So do you think we're going to go or we're going to stay?
I think we will go. But the question of the single market is something that may well be a fudge which is unacceptable. So the question of the government has announced in the last 24 hours that it's fairly confident that by the 21st of November it's going to strike a deal. I think there's been a lot of posturing also on the EU side to make life difficult. The Irish issue has been played up as well. There are technical solutions to the Irish problem, but the question, I think, will be resolved. Not necessarily.
Okay, gentlemen, time doesn't allow us to argue. What did you want to say?
This idea that we're playing up the Irish border issue, no, that is a major issue that we are looking to derail with our Brexit.
Let's see what happens.
Okay, but that is all that we have time for today on this edition of JHUK. So don't forget to follow us at Real JHUK on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Priscilla Winkle. I'm from the entire team and my guest, of course, here in London. Thank you for watching JHUK. Goodbye. See you soon.